Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, Bay Area Skeptics board member. Our speaker tonight is Ann Gibbons. She's a science journalist whom many of you will be familiar with from her articles in Science Magazine, Discover, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Slate, New York Times, and other places. Her specialty is human evolution, and as is often the case with the really good science journalists, she's put in her dues in the field in the Great Rift Valley of Africa, sifting through the Turkana desert sands and the hand axes of Orlogasale. Pardon. A native of Berkeley, she graduated from UC Berkeley, local girl makes good, and was also a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and a Science Journalism Fellow at the Marine Biological Laboratories in Woods Hole. Her science writing has been recognized by the American Geophysical Union, which gave her the Perlman Award for Excellence in Science Journalism, and twice has won the National Academy of Sciences Communication Award for Best Magazine or Newspaper Article. The American Anthropological Society awarded her their Anthropology and Media Award, not for any specific article, but for the general outstanding quality of her work. She was similarly honored by the Society for American Archaeology. Her book, The First Human, The Race to Discover Our Earliest Ancestors, was a finalist for the LA Times Best Science and Technology Book. Tonight she'll be speaking about some hominin species that hadn't even been discovered back when I was teaching human evolution. And I think you're going to find that how they relate to one another and how they relate to us Homo sapiens sapiens to be a very good story. And I fully expect to hear something from her about her percentage of Neanderthal genes, because I found that my percentage of Neanderthal genes was only 2.8%, which is pretty average for a European. And as a huge Neanderthal fan, I was really disappointed that I couldn't claim more Neanderthal ancestry. So we'll have a little contest here. And welcome to Bay Area Skeptics.
Nice to be here. Hi, Eugenie.
All right. We were talking a little bit before the program began about some of the people that we had known and admired in the field, and we. You mentioned that this is the 100th year anniversary of the discovery of the Tong baby, and that got us talking about Raymond Dart. And we were also talking, I brought up that this is also the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. And it's funny because I know a lot about the Scopes trial. I know a lot about the Tong baby, but for some reason, I never really thought, oh, wait, this first Australopithecine fossil was discovered the same year that John Scopes was being tried in Dayton, Tennessee for the effrontery of teaching human evolution. And for some reason, the two dates just never quite stuck in their mind, which now that I reflect on it, it's pretty silly.
No one believed the Tong child initially. Raymond Dart couldn't convince anyone it wasn't a baboon skull. It didn't look like what people expected a member of the human family to look like, right? So even though those were the same year, pre-expectations colored the way they were viewed.
Which, of course, has never happened since.
Yeah, exactly. It's a whole story, right? These hominins, the fossils people find, never are what people expect. It's really interesting.
Yeah. But I'm sure you deal with so many different people in the discovery business and the interpretation business. I'm kind of out of that biz by several decades by now, given my strange career trajectory, but just looking from afar. But the thing that just drives me nuts is when my colleagues in bioanthropology or paleoanthropology say, this discovery changes everything we've ever known about human evolution. I just want to hit them with a brick.
Yeah.
Because great, we found a new Neanderthal. That doesn't change anything that we knew about Homo erectus or about the Australopithecines or about the pre-Australopithecines, right? I mean, the whole idea that one fossil will change everything we've ever known about X, Y, and Z is a gross exaggeration.
Yeah. So I have some fun ones to talk about tonight, though. There are a couple discoveries that have changed things in a big way. So we'll come back to that.
Which does not
Maybe
mean
not everything
changed. So let's go and find out about what those and other discoveries have been. Take it away, Ann.
That's great. Put it into screen mode, slideshow. All right, here we go. Well, it's absolutely my pleasure to be here tonight. Thank you, Eugenie, for inviting me. You've waged the good fight on creationism. I am actually here to tell you probably the most interesting creation story of all time. You couldn't make up better stuff than what's coming out of real science. Great plot lines, characters you would never expect, strange combinations of interesting menageries of different hominins. So tonight I'm hoping to bring you through some of this. But I also want to say this period now, this is the story of us. But today there's only one species of hominin on the planet. And when I say hominin, I mean member of the human family or our ancestors, not ancestors of other apes like chimpanzees or gorillas. So hominins are our ancestors or us or our relatives that maybe went extinct but were closely related to us, upright walking apes and members of the human family. But what is so interesting to me today, one of the most interesting questions is we are the lone survivors. There's only one species of hominin left on the planet, but it was not that way for almost all of human evolution. From 6 to 7 million years ago until 30,000 years ago or so, there were always other kinds of humans on the planet, whether they were Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other creatures. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We're also going to talk about how in the past decade, there have been major discoveries. Maybe they didn't change everything, but they changed a lot. Where we found new members of the human family through fossils, but also using new tools like ancient DNA and ancient proteins. We have found hominins, fossils, that were mainly known for their genetics. And so we've had this strange thing where we've got genomes in search of a fossil record. So I'm going to go through some of these discoveries and talk about what we're learning from them and the revolution they're causing and the understanding of who we are, where we came from, how and when our ancestors spread around the world, and how we interacted. We'll mainly focus at the end on modern human origins and how we interacted with Neanderthals, because that's my title, and Denisovans. But first, let me talk about why me? And this is what Eugenie already anticipated. I am partly Neanderthal. I have 2.9% of my DNA, a little more than Eugenie's, according to 23andMe. And I've been very happy about that because it's more than my husband has, and I've been lording it over him ever since. These estimates are probably not exactly accurate. They're a little bit high, but many of us, many Europeans and Asians, have Neanderthal DNA today. People in Africa do not, and we'll talk about that later, why that is the case. I also have to say I got my start, my interest in writing about human evolution because of Neanderthals. So way back in 1987, I was a Knight Fellow at MIT, and I heard a lecture from David Pilbeam, a famous paleoanthropologist at Harvard. And he was really excited about the fact that at Skull Cave in Coffs in Israel, which is on Mount Carmel in Israel, researchers had found modern human remains in Skull Cave and nearby at Kafsa. These are two caves near each other in Mount Carmel that were alive in the last 120 to 130,000 years, maybe from about 60,000 to 120. What was thrilling was that nearby Kabara Cave, they found a Neanderthal. And if you look at Neanderthals, they look very different from us. And so new dates on these caves and these fossils suggested for the first time that these two different kinds of hominins could be contemporaries. So the old view had been that Neanderthals were more primitive than us and therefore were our ancestors. They were a separate species. And if you define a species by Ernst Mayr's biological concept of species, which is the main concept we have of what a species is, separate species are two different close related hominins, perhaps, that cannot interbreed and have offspring that have their own offspring. So if you cross a donkey with a horse, you get a mule. But the mule cannot have its own offspring. So the donkey and the horse are separate species. This was the thinking about Neanderthals and modern humans, that we really were separate species. They were around before us, that we couldn't have offspring. But suddenly, with this discovery at Skull Cave and Kabara and Kafsa, they were living at the same time in the same place. Now, it doesn't mean that they were actually saw each other, because the fossil record has lots of time in each layer of sediments. It could have been that they were in and out of the caves at different times, but this was a very exciting discovery, and it challenged a very neat view of human evolution and a prevailing view that one hominin dominated the landscape at any one time. Humans were seen as special. This was an Ernst Mayr idea as well, that humans and our ancestors were hard to compete with, and so there was only one major species on the landscape at one time, and they unfolded in a neat line of descent to modern humans. We're going to show how that's wrong. But to put this in context, first we're going to talk about time, deep time. And I live in Pittsburgh, so I'm a Steelers fan. If you were to plot the age of the planet 5 billion years across a football field, when do humans come into the picture and human ancestors? You see what this little football is on the right side of the screen? That football is 6 inches from the end zone. That's about 6 to 7 million years on a football field. Members of the human family, the earliest human ancestors that we know about, don't show up until very late in the age of the Earth, until 6 inches from the end zone. To zoom in on that period, 6 to 7 million years of human evolution. The details in this chart, there are lots of details, don't matter, so don't worry about that. But what I'm trying to show here is, at the beginning, our ancestors that we shared with chimpanzees separated from each other. And soon after that, we see very different kinds of upright walking apes. The defining trait of being a member of the human family is the first defining trait is upright walking. Darwin had proposed that upright walking, the big brain, and tool use all evolved at the same time. He proposed that in The Descent of Man in 1871. But what we have found in the last 25 years, this is the 1990s that we found orines, Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus, early fossils at the dawn of humanity, 6 to 7 million years ago. These fossils were walking upright before they had big brains and way before tools show up 2.6 million years ago. And my main point in showing this chart right now is to show that there are many different ways to be a member of the human family. And you can see Homo showing up around 2.5. That's our genus. Homo sapiens is way down here at 200,000 years ago. 6 million to 7 million is the age of the human family. Okay, so I want you to realize that Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, we all show up quite late in the game. 200,000 is a lot different than 6 to 7 million years. And so this is your Meet Your Ancestors slide. This is some of the earliest proposed members of the human family. On the left is Ardipithecus ramidus, who lived 4.4 million years ago. She lived in Ethiopia. We have several members of her species, and we actually have a couple species of Ardipithecus. These were very primitive, upright walking hominins. They don't look like us. Tim White, who discovered her, a researcher at Berkeley, who's now in Bilbao in Spain, said you would not invite them to dinner. These are not, These are not looking like members of the human family, but they're walking upright and they're beginning to do things that are different from other apes. For example, the males in this species have smaller canines, and maybe they were not competing as much for mates as, say, chimpanzees were. Maybe there are differences in social organization. Ardipithecus still lived in the trees, slept probably in a nest in the trees, walked along the tops of branches, but came down and walked upright, not like we did. It was a different, her big toe was a different kind of walk, but she was out there sometimes getting off down out of the trees and maybe looking for food between patches of trees. Sahelanthropus is a proposed hominin that lived 6 to 7 million years ago, Tumai here, in what is now the desert of Chad. May or may not have been an upright walking hominin as well. So these are the earliest members of the human family. You've all heard of Lucy, probably. Lucy is the most famous fossil. She's the first paleo rock star. I like to joke that she's the Taylor Swift of fossils. She was a partial skeleton discovered in 1974 in Ethiopia by Don Johansson and his student. And because they were listening to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, they dubbed her Lucy, and that gave her sort of a persona, and she caught the world's imagination. We have learned much from Lucy. She was alive about 3.2 million years ago. Here's her partial skeleton. She showed, along with the Tong child, which we mentioned earlier, Tong child was discovered 100 years ago, the first fossil hominin found in Africa, the very first fossil in Africa in 1924, 1925 by Raymond Dart. It showed, like Lucy, small brain walking upright. So it showed that Darwin was wrong about the whole package of upright walking and a big brain and tool use. Lucy at 3.2 million was one of many, about a half dozen different kinds of members of the genus Australopithecus. There was Africanus, which is what the Tong child was in South Africa. There's Lucy. There's Australopithecus anamensis, which is older than her. They adapted in different ways to different habitats, different diets, different ways of moving on the landscape. They may or may not have seen each other and other kinds of hominins that were paranthropus, bigger jawed, robust jawed, more robust kinds of hominins that were also around at the same time. So there wasn't just one neat line. Already we're finding different kinds of hominins that were around. This Lucy and other members of Australopithecus may have been the first tool makers as well. We don't know for sure, but there are stone tools that show up 3.3 million years ago in Lamiqui, and some people think a member of Australopithecus might have been the first tool maker. Others think, no, it was more like 2.6 million years ago when we find the first members of our genus Homo. It isn't until about 2.5 million years ago that we get members of our genus Homo, and then we're looking at jaws and some teeth that begin to look like something that is in our genus that's more like, not like modern humans, but evolving toward us. Homo erectus is probably the hallmark keystone species that we all think of when we think of the first member of the human family with a bioplan, a sort of body that is tall like us. There was a teen Narikotomi boy that was quite tall, close to 6 feet, walked upright, big brain. The big brain starts to expand before Homo erectus shows at around 2 million, but it has a real surge in growth around 1.6 million years ago. The other thing that's really cool about Homo erectus is this is a globetrotter. Homo erectus is probably, or maybe Homo habilis, which is a little more primitive version that came a little before it, was the first hominin to get out of Africa. And it's found at 1.8 million years and Dominici, under this beautiful medieval church on this promontory that is at the fork of two rivers, this sort of medieval monastery, and underneath it, in this fossil site in the Republic of Georgia, they found a half dozen members of early Homo, which they're calling Homo erectus, in this beautiful spot where these early members of Homo erectus had a rough life. They were found in sort of little burrows with a pile of cobblestones beside them, and fearsome predators, maybe they used the cobblestones to fight off these predators. But they were all the way up north in Dominici, which is kind of amazing to think about. The other thing to note is if these are the first hominins we know of that got out of Africa at about 1.8 million. This means there was 4 million years of evolution before that in Africa. So Africa is our homeland where so much of human evolution took place. But hominins start getting out. They start being able to trek over longer distances. This is important because they give rise to a diverse array of hominins both in Africa and out of Africa. And descendants of Homo erectus persisted in Indonesia, and in Asia, in Europe, and in Africa until almost 100,000 years ago, maybe 30,000 if you count Neanderthals. So Homo erectus seems to have given rise to these two really cool little creatures, little hominins, that were found on the islands of Indonesia, which are almost like refugia, where they moved out. The first one was a little hominin known as Lusa. I always have trouble saying this one. I'm sorry. Lusensis. Lusensis lived about, let's get my exact dates here, lived 50 to 80,000 years ago on an island very close to Flores where the Hobbit lived. You may have heard about the Hobbit, which was in this beautiful cave on the island of Flores. The Hobbit lived about 60,000 years ago. And what's really interesting about these little primitive hominins that lived until recently is because they were living on islands, they went through something called island dwarfism. They got very small because resources are scarce on an island. And they lived with little stegodonts and little Komodo dragons. So these were little interesting microcosm worlds where it's like a menagerie of different kinds of hominins were living. And unfortunately, they seem to disappear about the same time that modern humans show up in Europe. We don't know what happened to them, but you have to wonder, what is it about? When modern humans appear, other creatures die off. Meanwhile, in Europe, we begin to see the first signs of Neanderthals around 400,000 years ago. There's a cave in Spain called Atapuerca in northern Spain, in this one pit called Cima de los Huesos, which means pit of the bears. There are a lot of bones. And when they looked at these bones that are a little over 400,000 years and looked at the mitochondrial DNA, this is the DNA that comes from your mitochondria, which are the energy factories of your cells. When they looked at the mitochondrial DNA, they saw that these hominins were very closely related to Neanderthals. They're sort of like proto-Neanderthals, very early Neanderthals. And so that was an amazing discovery that showed that Neanderthals were in Europe starting as early as 400,000 years ago. And back in Africa, things were also moving along. We found around a new discovery in the last decade has been the discovery of Homo naledi. This is another little creature that lived in the caves of the Rising Star Cave Network, which is down near the Cradle of Humanity, not far from where the Tong Child was found. It lived 235,000 to 300,000 years ago, and it was found deep, deep, deep in this pit of caves, a whole bunch of them. Small brain, upright walker. The researchers that have found them claim that they were burying their dead and using fire, maybe even making art. Those claims are pretty wild. Most researchers don't believe them. So we're all waiting for more evidence to see what this creature was doing. Hopefully they'll get some ancient DNA or ancient proteins to find out where it fits in the human family tree. So with DNA and proteins, you can build a family tree. The more amino acids you share, or the more DNA nucleic acids you share with another creature, the more closely you are related. Meanwhile, our species was beginning to emerge in Africa as well. So around in the last 600,000 years, there are a number of fossils that start showing up that have traits that show hominins are beginning to evolve to look a little more like Homo sapiens. So this is 500,000 years ago. The first proto-Homo sapiens that many people think might be ancestral to Homo sapiens is from Morocco, Jebel Irhoud, 300,000 years ago. Now, this is not Homo sapiens. It's a proto-Homo sapiens with a flat middle face, a little more like Homo sapiens, and some other traits that suggest that it was related to the ancestors of Homo sapiens. There are other traits and other fossils around Africa too, though, that show evolution toward a more modern form. So maybe there were separate populations of hominids, different forms, maybe interbreeding at the edges on their way toward becoming modern humans. Some of the most important are fossils at Herto, Ethiopia, and Omo Kabish, 160,000, 195,000 years ago. that are recognized as the earliest members of Homo sapiens. These are the hair-toe people here. And when they were discovered, it was remarkable at 160,000 years ago in Ethiopia, remarkable how much they looked just like us. They weren't acting just like us, but they were looking a lot like us already at 160,000 years ago in Africa. So it's really, the best evidence is that modern humans arose in Africa, while Neanderthals were in Europe, and a lot of other creatures were out and about in Indonesia and other places. So this first shows its face in Ethiopia. I was lucky enough to go there with Tim White, who's demonstrating his fossil hunting method, like collecting seashells at the seashore, stooped over. It's hard work. It's tremendously hard work when you go to the field with different teams. I've been lucky enough to go with a number of different teams around the world. And what I grew greatly appreciative of when I spent time with Tim's crew is how much time they have to spend trying to be strategic, to go to different sites that are spread out all over the Afar Valley of Ethiopia, in the Middle Awash, which is the Rift Valley of Ethiopia, and to try to figure out where to go, where fossils are rotting out at the right time, to spend time looking. Then when you find a fossil, how much time to put into one site to look for those fossils, to negotiate with the locals to get access to those areas, and then also to work and respect the local people. These are some of the Afar people we met along the way. And as an aside, this woman here, we stopped because an older woman and her family had been bitten by a snake, and Tim stopped to treat the snake wound. While he was doing that, this woman offered me her baby to take home to the US. This told me everything I needed to know about how hard her life is. Nomadic people trying to live on the landscape in Ethiopia. And sadly now, many of the tribes there's a lot of violence between the tribes. They've got old Kalashnikovs and AK-47s, and it's a tough existence. And this is the environment in which these fossil hunters are trying to find Africans and Europeans and Americans trying to find members of the human family. So the point of this slide, okay, so modern humans arose in East Africa around 180,000 years ago or so. Then they start leaving in small pulses up through the Middle East, and different bands start getting out. Around 135,000 or so, we start to see modern humans in the Middle East, including the Skull and Kafsa sites at 135,000. We see Neanderthals coming down into the Middle East and in Europe. And what's important about this slide is the Neanderthal technologies are the red squares. The modern human toolkit, which looks different. The Neanderthals use something called a Mousterian toolkit, which is different from the toolkit, the Aurignacian, that the modern humans carried. These are stone tools that have distinct differences. What's really interesting about this is people wondered, how did modern humans interact with Neanderthals when they moved into Europe, into Eurasia? Well, what's interesting is when you look at the distribution of stone tools, you see Neanderthal tools moving out to the edges when modern humans move in. It's like throwing a stone in the middle of a pond and the ripples going out. And so we knew from fossils and archaeology 20 years ago, at least, that there was some kind of interaction there, and that Neanderthals didn't really want to be around modern humans all that much, that there was movement away. There's something going on there, but still there was a question. They were seen as a separate species, not members of our species, and maybe we were contemporaries, but how did they relate? It was a big, big mystery. Then we got a new tool, the DNA revolution. And here we have a cave in Croatia, Vindija Cave, famous cave of Neanderthal fossils. And here is Svante Pääbo. He's a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. At the time, he was a researcher in Munich. He's the son of a Swedish Nobel laureate. His mother worked as in the lab of the Swedish Nobel laureate. He was the son of her. He was born, they weren't married. He was born as the Nobel laureates, and he won a Nobel Prize 2 years ago for his research using ancient DNA in human evolution. No one ever wins a Nobel Prize in human evolution research. So this is really kind of a mind-blowing big deal. What he did is he decided he was going to try to sequence the genome of a Neanderthal, which was an audacious idea, crazy audacious idea when he first proposed it. But interestingly, I asked him about that not long ago and asked him, when you did that, how did you make sure that you weren't going to fail terribly? especially when you have students. And he said he always has a grand idea, but then he has a second idea to work on too that keeps the grad students with work to do, which I thought was very interesting. You've got your very risky research idea, but cherry picking the right idea to work on is very important in science. So he managed to get extract DNA from bones in Denisova cave. And when he sequenced the DNA, this was in 2010, he got about 1.3x coverage of the genome. That means about 30% was missing. Nonetheless, it was enough that he could align this fragmentary Neanderthal DNA with the DNA of modern humans, living modern humans from Europe, Asia, and Africa. And what he saw blew him away. He saw that living Europeans and Asians, and here we have Johannes Kraus, who now runs his own lab at the Max Planck, extracting the DNA. He was part of it, his team, getting the DNA out of the Neanderthal bones. What he found, the Neanderthal genome, is that living Europeans and Asians outside of Africa had inherited between 1% and 4% of their nuclear DNA from Neanderthals. But sub-Saharan Africans had not. At first, he didn't believe it. But this suggested that there was some low-level interbreeding. Then, soon after, there was a second bombshell. This map is here only to show you where Denisova cave is. This is a cave in Siberia at the intersection of this triangle right near Mongolia, which is it's to its southeast, and Kazakhstan. These are the Altai Mountains. It's about 12 time zones across Russia to get there. I know because I did that. And it's beautiful countryside and a lot of cattle farming going on there now. But the old Altai Mountain and Altai people live in these sort of wooden teepees. And it's southern Siberia with wildflowers. In this beautiful cave right here with a big, big view, Russian scientists discovered these molars. This is, let me get the names right. This is Shunkov. This is Mikhail Shunkov and Anatoly Derevienko of the Russian Academy of Sciences in Novosibirsk. They worked for decades here, and their team found these molars. And these molars were bigger than Neanderthal molars, but they weren't modern human molars. And they didn't know what to make of them. So they decided to send a little sample, a small amount of these molars to two different labs. One of them was the lab of Svante Pääbo. And they also brought in, the year I was there I got to be there with David Reich, a population geneticist from Harvard. And this young woman worked in Svante Pääbo's lab. Here's a French archaeologist, Monty Slacken of Berkeley, a population geneticist. A whole team of researchers we all went to the Altai to try to look at this cave and to look at the sediments. Layer 11, this is where Svante Pääbo is standing in the cave, layer 11, where in addition to the teeth, they found a tiny pinky finger bone, just a tiny little piece of finger bone, this little piece right here. And from that finger bone, they were able to get, let me get the exact amount here. Svante Pääbo was able to extract 40 milligrams of bone removed from underneath the surface of the finger bone by sterile dentistry drill in a clean room. When they sequenced it, they got such a high quality genome. It was like 40x coverage, which is like getting a modern human's genome because the conditions in the cave were so good. It's not only was it cold, but it was consistent cold temperature. To get really good ancient DNA, you want consistent temperatures. You don't want a lot of hot, cold that damages the DNA. And when they sequenced it, they got a huge surprise. And this is one of those things, one of those discoveries that does change everything, Eugenie. This one was, they found it wasn't a Neanderthal and it wasn't a modern human. It belonged to a new kind of hominin. But what was it? They just called it a Denisovan because they didn't know what it was. And just briefly, before I go into the implications of how they worked on it, this is the view from the cave. It's a stunning, almost Chekhov landscape with cedar and birch, and you look down over a river down below, and whatever hominins were in this cave, big gallery cave with lots of light coming in, could see all the animals and other kinds of hominids coming along the river valley. It turned out this was a crossroads when the climate wasn't too bad during periods when it was warmer, and at least two kinds of hominins were in this cave, Denisovans and Neanderthals, off and on for tens of thousands of years, and I mean, more than tens of thousands, for 200,000 years, and later modern humans were also in this cave. It was quite a spectacular spot that drew humans over time, different kinds of humans. So when they sequenced the genome, they then aligned the Denisovan DNA, they aligned it with the same segments of DNA from 53 populations of living humans. They found that Denisovans shared 4 to 6% of their DNA with living Melanesians from Papua New Guinea and the Bougainville Islands. They later found that Denisovan DNA was also in Australian Aboriginals, Philippine Negritos, and very low levels in some Chinese, Han Chinese. They also had all these people also had Neanderthal DNA, but in addition, they had some Denisovan DNA. But the Denisovans were in the Altai Mountains. How did this happen? How did people across Asia end up with Denisovan DNA? So this was the huge mystery that brought a lot of different archaeologists and anthropologists to Siberia. I'm just showing some photos to show what a beautiful spot it is. This is in June, in the summer. So here's the explanation. This is the most likely scenario. As modern humans came out of Africa 50 to 60,000 years ago. Okay, first let me say something else. Modern humans have been coming out in pulses out of Africa probably for 120, 130,000 years, ever since they evolved in East Africa. But most of those little groups of hominins went extinct. They didn't leave offspring. There was a migration 50 to 60,000 years ago that included founders or hominins, humans, modern humans, that were ancestral to all people out of Africa. So it was a founder effect. Out of that small band of people, there were huge population expansions, and they went into the Middle East where they encountered Neanderthals, probably in the Middle East, interbred with them, somewhere in Eurasia, picked up some Neanderthal DNA. Then a subset later went off into Asia where they encountered the Denisovans. And the Denisovans weren't just in the Altai Mountains up north, but they were also throughout Asia. We know this because so much of the Denisovan DNA is in Melanesia, and there have been some other discoveries I'll talk about shortly that suggest they were all throughout Asia. So this is a really interesting scenario. And then some of the ones with Neanderthal DNA, but not Denisovan, went on into Europe. Those modern humans went into Europe and encountered Neanderthals there too. But when exactly did that interbreeding happen? This has been a big mystery. People thought sometime in the last 60,000 years, but we know modern humans were in the Middle East before that. When did this all happen? One way to find out is to, instead of just looking at Neanderthal DNA in living humans, is to go look at fossils of modern humans throughout Eurasia. So researchers have done that in the last decade. And recently, just this year, they found in Bachokiro Cave, modern humans that lived 43 to 47,000 years ago, and not long ago, modern humans 45,000 years ago in Ust-Yushim, Russia, and these other sites throughout Europe, they found that they had a lot more Neanderthal DNA because they lived much more recently after the inbreeding event. And by looking at that DNA, they were able to nail down the date when the interbreeding happened. And it looks like modern humans interbred around 45 to 47,000 years ago. The fossil at Bachokiro Cave had a Neanderthal ancestor just 6 generations before it lived, only 140 to 160 years earlier. And you can use the amount of DNA and the rate at which we know DNA evolves as sort of a clock to date when these encounters happened. So we're really beginning to nail down this encounter. And what's so cool about it is initially people thought that the interbreeding was very rare between Neanderthals and modern humans, that this was not wholesale wife swapping. Instead, the thinking was that maybe there was some probably rapes at the edges as, modern humans moved into Neanderthal territory. It was hard to know how often. Well, these new studies of the ancient modern human fossils suggest that there was a period 45 to 77,000 years ago where quite a few people got Neanderthal DNA. It wasn't just a couple times. It was substantial enough that that's why we carry a lot of it today. So we nailed down the dates. We nailed down roughly the area, probably Middle East, moving into Europe, somewhere Balkans, something like that. And 2 new studies this year show that the Neanderthal DNA, which makes up they're saying 2 to 4% of the genes in all mutant living humans outside of Africa resulted not from a few dalliances, but many generations of mixing. Researchers suspect, what about those modern humans that moved out of Africa earlier? There are claims of sites in Australia and Europe that could be 65,000 years, older ones in the Middle East. Either those weren't fully modern humans, or they're just populations of modern humans whose offspring went extinct. So the next question is, here's the story from this year. My colleague Mike Price wrote it, that showed that it's 47,000 years ago. And this came from two groups. A group of researchers, two different teams came up with the same result, analyzing ancient DNA of modern human fossils. So the next question that came up is, what did we get from these encounters? This is obviously a very interesting question. So researchers have done things. Tony Capra, who's now at UC San Francisco, looked at medical records across the US. Other people looked at data banks, and they looked to see what diseases or traits were correlated with different genes, right? Different ancient DNA. And we now think that genes that we got from Neanderthals do everything from boost our immune systems to make our blood clot faster. And let's decide about that. Traits that we picked up in the Paleolithic that we picked up 47,000 years ago may have been advantageous then. Maybe not necessarily today, where we live longer and we don't want our blood to coagulate. But maybe when you're a Neanderthal or a modern human living 47,000 years ago and you get injured, you want your blood to coagulate quickly so you don't bleed out. But now that we live into our 80s and 90s, it causes problems with our hearts and strokes. These genes also influence how people respond to sunlight exposures, sleep patterns, how we store fat, how we metabolize fat, and our mood. They affect all sorts of different functions. Neanderthal gene variants govern levels of cholesterol and vitamin D and influence the risk of developing eating disorders, rheumatoid arthritis, and schizophrenia, as well as response to antipsychotic drugs and the ability to store belly fat, which is very interesting to me. Diabetes risk. This prevalence of diabetes too. About half of Native Americans and Mexicans and Latin Americans have inherited a gene associated with diabetes, SLC16A11, that's thought to cause an alteration in lipid metabolism, and it could potentially explain 1/4 of the health disparity in type 2 diabetes. This seems to be a gene that came from Neanderthals. Meanwhile, what did Neanderthals get from us? I wrote a story this year about that. Someone went back and looked at ancient Neanderthal DNA to see, what did they get from us? And one thing that's very, very interesting is that they got 10% of their genome for us, a lot more. That's because populations of Neanderthals were much smaller by the time we encountered them than populations of modern humans. Neanderthals were down to maybe as few as 10,000 breeding adults that were able to have offspring. By the time we encountered them, they were struggling. And there were different populations. There was a population that was near Vindicia Cave in Europe, and there was a population in Asia. These were different groups, but their genetic diversity had declined. Their numbers were down. In come modern humans. And what did they get from us? They got genes involved in brain development. We also found from looking at the Neanderthal DNA that they interbred with us early and often. So we know that modern humans that are alive today got their DNA from Neanderthals 47,000 years ago or so. But Neanderthals and modern humans were mating before that, even though many of them went extinct. More than 200,000 years ago, then around 105 to 120,000 years ago, and then around 45,000 to 60,000 years ago, the mating was more common than previously thought. Excuse me. So this is interesting. Neanderthals picked up genes from us. So this new picture, before we go into that one, let me talk about Neanderthals a little longer. The new picture blurs the boundaries between Neanderthals and modern humans, and it identifies features of the Neanderthal genome, suggesting that our big-brained, heavy-browed relatives were pitifully rare, and also that they were very closely related to us in many ways. This is also part of the makeover of Neanderthals in recent years. The genetics have contributed to that, as well as studies of their isotopes that tell us what their diet was, their tools, how they were using the landscape. What we know now is they weren't so very different from us. Not only were we able to interbreed with them, so they weren't even a separate species, but a population that had diverged. There's these sort of what we used to think of as brutish, violent meat eaters are now seen as our close relatives who bury their dead, make art, cooked porridge. They cooked barley porridge before the origins of agriculture. They ate shellfish and their veggies. So Neanderthals are much more interesting than we used to think of them. But what happened to them? Did our DNA swamp? I keep going to this slide. I'm not ready for it. Did our DNA swamp them out because there were so many of us? I'll come back to that. Meanwhile, we've also been studying what modern humans got from Denisovans. Tibetans have inherited a super athlete gene, a version of an EPIS1 gene from Denisovans that helps them use less oxygen at high altitude. It's helped them have a high altitude adaptation. This doesn't mean that Denisovans were at high altitude, but they had a gene that turned out to be advantageous later in Tibetans at high altitude. There also are genes that are involved with skin, follicles, hair DNA, immune genes. And what this reveals about evolution that is so interesting to me is that when you think about when modern humans came out of Africa, or any migrating peoples coming out of any planet, as they move into a new continent or landscape, they have to adapt to a new habitat, new foods. They don't know what plants are toxic, new diseases, new climate. So how do they do that? Either they're lucky and they have some genes already that help them adapt to these new conditions, and they can wait for a long time on natural selection favors those genes, which then rise to high frequency in a population, probably what happened in Neanderthals in Northern Europe, or they can mix with the locals. And if you mix with the locals, you can pick up genes that they have that allowed them to adapt to the new habitat much more rapidly. And this is known as adaptive introgression. And by studying Neanderthal and modern human DNA and Denisovan DNA, we now know that adaptive introgression was a really important genetic process that allowed our ancestors to move into new habitats and hemispheres and climates and adapt and survive quickly. They were able to pick up these new genes that were advantageous. Now, of course, they also picked up genes that weren't advantageous, and probably many of them died. We often talk about with the origin of agriculture, children that couldn't process grains, babies that couldn't process grains or other agricultural foods probably died off in rapid numbers. So this reveals a lot about evolution. There was this shortcut by interbreeding. You pick up traits that can help you adapt to an environment. I want to make sure, though, that this doesn't presume that that's progress. So when we talk about adaptive traits that are good in one habitat but not another, you can think of things like skin color. Having light skin is advantageous in the north because you need to absorb more vitamin D to keep your bones strong. But if you live in Africa, you want darker skin so you don't get skin cancer. So it's not that modern humans had picked up, that this was progress and picked up better traits. It's just that the traits they got helped them survive in different habitats. And there's something about modern humans where they were really able to adapt well to a wide range of habitats. The next question that came up with all this DNA, another really interesting one, is we had this strange situation with Denisovans where we had a genome in search of a fossil record. So remember, we only had a tiny finger bone, piece of finger bone, and a few molars. This was the whole fossil record, and yet amazing DNA. So this set in motion a race to try to find the Denisovans in Asia. And the most exciting first discoveries that came out in 2019 was a fossil jaw in a cave on the Tibetan plateau of China, and Bashiria Karst Cave, and a Chinese team found this huge bone. Well, Monk found this bone, but they went back to the cave and found more and tested this bone, and they found proteins in this bone that suggest it was a Denisovan, not a Neanderthal or a modern human, which is pretty exciting. They've since found some more bones and sedimentary DNA. You can now get DNA from the sediments at fossil sites that shows that Denisovans were in this cave on the Tibetan plateau of China. Meanwhile, researchers are looking at lots of fossils that were hard to classify, fossils that really weren't Neanderthals, but really weren't modern humans. And recently they proposed, some Chinese researchers proposed that the stunning dragon man skull that was at the bottom of a well for many years, it's a long, fascinating story, that this fossil was a new species of hominin. Many people think, this could be a Denisovan. They weren't able to get DNA from it, but this may be the face that we're looking at. And the search goes on to find the Denisovans. We also have hints from DNA of ghost lineages. So when you look at Cima de los Huesos, the ancestors of Neanderthals from the pit in Spain, there's some DNA there that is not Neanderthal and that is not Denisovan, is not modern human. Could it be Homo erectus? Or could it be Homo heidelbergensis or something else that was alive 500,000 years ago? So we are all these different kinds of hominins around. We interbred with them. We still carry some of them with us. Maybe we swamp them out. What happened to them? Why are we the lone survivors? This is the $6 million question. Did we kill them with disease? Did modern humans bring a new virus, like a COVID or something much worse, like when the Europeans killed Native Americans with smallpox when they came to the Americans? Did we have social networks that were more robust? There's a lot of thinking that modern humans had some kind of cognitive ability to have more complex social networks. For example, maybe I make some beads that I give to you in another group so that when I encounter you later that we know each other. Maybe I'm having hard times and not getting enough food, but we know that we've met before and maybe you share your resources with me. Maybe my trade networks were larger, more extensive than they were for Neanderthals. Maybe that's a way to outcompete. Maybe I could have my babies in more rapid succession. Maybe my diet allowed me to have more offspring more rapidly, which swamped out the Neanderthals as well. Finally, were we more skilled at battle? Some people suggested we had better projectile weapons. Or did we just outnumber them? This is the next mystery to solve. We don't know why they all disappeared when modern humans show up. I don't think it's going to be a happy story. It isn't a happy story when modern humans show up now with hunter-gatherers and outcompete them and their way of life disappears. Or Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals, these suggest that what happened with Neanderthals and Denisovans and Homo floresiensis and luzensis and all these other different kinds of humans that were on the planet was probably not a happy story. Also, why do we survive? Another line of research going on now, Svante Pääbo is studying the differences in brain genetics and gene expression in Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, trying to see if there are hints in the way our brains work. Is there something there? Trying to get at the heart of what makes us human. What is that subtle difference that makes us different from Neanderthals and Denisovans? So I'm going to end on that note. I think for me, what is really interesting to me over all the years I've covered human evolution is that there are many ways to be a member of the human family, many ways to be a human. And it fascinates me. I mean, imagine what it'd be like today to go out and ride the subway or walk on the beach and see another kind of human. Today we're all very closely related to each other genetically. Any two humans on this planet are more alike genetically than two subspecies of chimpanzees in Africa. It wasn't always so. There was much more diversity of humans, and it's fascinating to think about that and to think that we still carry the legacy with us. So with that, I'm going to finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there are a lot of things to think about with all of the things that you've been presenting to us, and thank you so much. It was very, very coherent and very, very a very good and unfortunately quick summary of a lot of material. But, there are some sites there that I didn't know about, so that's very cool. I'm very pleased to hear
it's a fast-moving field, believe me, and especially when it's interdisciplinary and you have, archaeologists, paleoanthropologists, and geneticists. It's just in population geneticists. It's a very interdisciplinary field. I mean, some of these fossil sites are 50 different PhDs were just working on a fossil site. Right. From the dating to the isotopes to the paleobotany. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah.
And it's the way to get the better research done, because you're getting so many different components of the same adaptation of the same group. Yeah, it's terrific. I was just reflecting a little bit on your last comment about the tendency for anatomically modern humans to move into an area and whatever was there before doesn't last. Right. And the various hypotheses about why it would, were they absorbed? Were they just beaten up? And, did you ever read The Inheritors by William Golding?
Oh, I have not. I should put that on my
Oh,
list. Yeah.
oh, you got to read that. It's sort of everybody.
Heard of it.
Um,
Yeah.
No, it's a view of supposedly what happens to a population, a family group of Neanderthals when the anatomical moderns come in.
Mm.
And they literally are hunted. Well, I'm going to spoil it, but what matters is reading it rather than knowing what, because the outcome eventually.
Right. Right.
Basically, the moderns just sort of go through and pick off all the family members. But what makes it, footnote here, what makes it a really interesting read is that Golding does it from the standpoint of the primitive hominid.
Oh, interesting.
He puts you in the mind of and at first you read, what the heck is going on? Because it's all these impressions that come in, and it's not a narrative like you're used to reading. So it's a fascinating book. Golding intended it to be Neanderthal moderns. I think the kind of level of cognition and communication that he's really reflecting in his treatment of these primitives is more like Homo erectus, because these guys, I mean, Neanderthals must have been able to communicate a whole lot better than Golding's hominins are communicating.
Yeah.
And anyway, check out the book. But there's this idea that the moderns came in and slaughtered the poor old Neanderthals, or they make love not war. They absorbed them. They outcompeted them, that they didn't actually have that much interaction, although now we know they did, as you explained.
Right.
There have been lots of examples of really fairly close interbreeding. But I think we should get away from this idea that one answer solves our problem. It doesn't have to be any one.
That's
There's
exactly
no
what
reason,
I'm thinking while I'm listening to you.
there's no reason why it couldn't be all three, or some in this area, some different explanation.
all of it.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
all of the
Because
above.
whenever two groups encounter each other, there's going to be some violence, some rape, some, consensual. Who knows how that all worked with the interbreeding. And
some
getting along,
competition.
not, right? And some sharing resources, some not. It would be, I wish we could go back and see. I don't know how we find that from the fossil record or genetics, if we ever will be able to answer that question. But it is a romantic, interesting idea. It's just fascinating to think that we had these close encounters. I had a really interesting discussion many years ago. Milford Walpoff, who's a paleoanthropologist at the University of Michigan, said something really cool. He was talking, and he talked about how, there may be some kind of deep memory we have of Neanderthals and other kinds of hominins. It's almost like in the stories we have about the troll under the bridge and giants. It's almost like in our storytelling and in our lore, there's something very deep, the giants or the other kinds of hominins, that there really was a time when there were other kinds. It's not,
Yeah, I know. I love Milford. He's a really trippy guy. But the wild man of the wood kind of folklore that you find in Eurasian populations, it's also very likely the stem of the idea of Bigfoot.
Yeah, exactly.
There's which is according to some, is supposed to be a Gigantopithecus, but there you have.
Right.
We do have some questions, and I want to give other people a chance, but I was interested when you were talking about what did we get from Neanderthals? What did Neanderthals get from us? We know, as you pointed out, and we've got very, very good data and theory to explain why it is that dark-skinned people live in equatorial regions and lighter-skinned people live in northern regions, having to do with skin cancer in one and vitamin D availability, calcium adequacy, and so forth in the other. And I know that there are some of the Neanderthal genome indicates that some of them had red hair, which is very cool.
Yeah. Although lately, I did write a story about a year or two ago, which I wonder if I can call up. Did I keep it on I had it up recently. The traits that influence appearance, not so much. The immune genes, yes, we got that from them. The problem with the traits that influence appearance is there's more diversity in them than we realize. So there were Neanderthals that had dark hair, right? There were Neanderthals So that had been an idea that was floated out there. There's a little more skepticism about some of those appearance kind of genes now. I think probably we're better, probably the immune genes and the metabolism, the blood clotting. These are the things that really have more solid underfooting. The red hair thing is for some reason just not holding up as well, which is interesting. That's how they determine. You really need to do that. You can't just look at the correlation of the gene and the trait. You have to actually do gene expression studies.
Yeah,
that's no work to do it, right? Or look at data banks and see correlation of many people to be able to make a claim on that. But
I know that there also have been claims that of pigmentation in, say, the feathered dinosaurs. That some of those, I mean, is that also been,
that first came out? Yes.
Has that also been challenged?
I don't know, because I haven't written about that. That might be more solid ground. I think that the notion that a Neanderthal, that we got red hair from them, is just that the Neanderthals they happen to study happen to have red hair, and there are not that many Neanderthals. A few of them or one of them, but not all of them, right? There are not that many Neanderthals that have been sequenced. So
I mean, point being, I think where I was going with that was that something like, red hair is usually also correlated with things like freckling and lighter skin and stuff. I mean, it's kind of a package. It's a northern thing.
Exactly.
I don't imagine that there was a heck of a lot of redheads in Equatorial, in the populations of Africans that moved north to the out of Africa Homo sapiens. Probably not a whole lot.
They were darker skinned and darker hair, and definitely
they'd be selected against real fast.
Exactly.
As those of us with inadequate melanin know when we go to tropical areas.
Exactly.
All right. I shouldn't be I could talk with you all night, and that would be very rude to all the people who would like to have their questions answered. So may we have the first question, please? When artists create representations of early hominins, isn't the thickness of body hair almost entirely speculative? And this is from Joe Hutchings.
That's a really good question. So there's real variation in these artists' representations. For example, I'm a huge fan of John Gershie's work. He goes to all the meetings. He's an anatomist by training. He takes all the notes. He really thinks it through very carefully. And I would say there's science to back up everything he does. Some of these illustrations that popped up, maybe not as much. There's probably more artistic license. And the thickness of body hair, you might now be able to get a handle on, because we have some of the genes about different kinds of hair. But I'm not able to answer that exactly. I'm sure that sometimes it's speculative. It's got to be speculative. And I'll send an email to John and ask him. I think that's a good question.
Well, I mean, you can also make some generalizations. I mean, that modern humans are really quite glabrous, and they have hair in funny places, like the top of their heads and the axillae between their legs. They have hair in kind of weird places. And we also know that our non-hominid, our ape relatives, they have, interestingly enough, they're almost negatives of us. They don't have a lot of hair on the top of their head. They don't have hair in the axilla. But they're hairy every place else. And we still have those follicles, but they're not developed. I mean, we also
had a date when we got to be hairless. I don't remember the exact date, because the body lice. There was one species of body lice, and then there were two, and that's thought to be because that's when we lost a lot of our body hair. And I can't remember what the date was on that. It's a really interesting.
This just underscores your earlier point about the importance of working with different specialists. Right. You don't just work with the bone and teeth people. As an old bone and tooth person, that doesn't really hurt my feelings. I mean,
right. But you do get straight hair more correlated with certain climates, and there are hair that works better in the tropics. So some of that isn't wild speculation.
No, that's true. Hair shape is, again, you make analogies with known similar species and adaptations. Could we have another question, please? David Rousman wants to know, who did Neanderthals evolve from? Heidelbergensis?
So Heidelbergensis is one of the best candidates out there, but this is a really murky period. So between about 1.2 million and 500,000 years ago in Europe, we have at Australopithecus alone, where we find that pit of bones of early Neanderthals, there's Homo antecessor at 1.2 million, and there's other early Homo in there, and they're claiming, the researchers that work there, that these are the earliest Europeans, and they're not calling it Heidelbergensis. Chris Stringer at the National History Museum might call some of these things in Europe Heidelbergensis. So, what's in a name? How important is the name of the species? There were definitely descendants of Homo erectus or something like Homo erectus in Europe in the last 1.2, 1.3 million years. And I know that some more work is coming out on that area. Which species? Hard to know. Really hard to know. Is Heidelbergensis the actual ancestor, or is it related to something like that?
It is. There's some, there's some group back at that time period that did give rise later to anatomical modern humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans. And I don't think anybody's really quite, figured out that trichotomy there. I mean, it took a very long time to figure out humans, chimps, and gorillas.
Exactly.
It's even murkier when you're
go back
within a
that
species.
far.
Yeah.
The proteins go back, for half a million or so, but the DNA doesn't go back that far in humans, not yet. Anyway, we haven't been able to find it that early.
And
so this has to be the fossils. Yeah.
Speaking of proteins, we have a question about how do they know if a sequence of nucleotide bases is a Neanderthal sequence or a Homo sapien sequence?
So they're looking across the genome, and Neanderthals have higher frequencies of certain nucleotides at specific sites. And if you see the pattern of many of the Neanderthal frequencies in a genome, it's a Neanderthal, right? So it's not just one site, one nucleotide base they're looking at. They're looking at the whole genome. And there are patterns more frequencies of certain nucleotides in Neanderthals that you see. You see a T maybe at a site that you don't see in a modern human. And so you get enough of those across the genome, you've got a Neanderthal genome. It just matches up. The software pairs up and clusters Neanderthal genomes. They put them on a sorting tree, and you can find them that way. Proteins are a little more iffy. The amino acids, this is a very new area, but they're saying they're able to distinguish Neanderthals from modern humans and Denisovans based on, it's sort of early work. There's a team in Copenhagen doing this, and Cambridge, which is fascinating. And that's amino acid differences, right, in different proteins.
May we have another question, please? From Tanya. Did Neanderthals have hominin ancestors in Africa?
Well, Homo erectus. So, the first hominin to get out of Africa that we know around 1.82 million years ago, those African hominins that came out of Africa, one of them somewhere gave rise, some group gave rise to Neanderthals. So what happens with human evolution is you have a species, it moves out into way new species form is they usually move into different geographic areas. And maybe there's a mountain in between or a river. So with chimpanzees and bonobos in Africa, there's the Zaire River. They originally had the same population, they were the same thing, but one group was one side of the river, the other side of the river. They have over enough time evolved genetic differences to become different species. This is true with Homo erectus or anything that came out of Africa. Its descendants ended up in different places, separated from each other for a long, long time, thousands and thousands of years, and they evolved into different species. This is the biological species concept. Geographic boundaries are what are most often create differences. There can be other things that create differences too, whether it's diet or we now know, for example, different hominins lived in the same time and place and were able to compete in the same time and place because maybe they had different diets. There's a very exciting site in South Africa right now, Drimmelen and Kromdraai, where there are a couple sites in the cradle of humanity where they find the earliest Homo erectus at 2 million years, just before it was Australopithecus, and in the same layers they're finding Paranthropus, which had very robust jaws and a very different diet than Homo erectus. So these hominins were all in this small geographic area at the same time, eating different resources, so able to compete in the same spot. That's exciting. This old notion of one species at one time is just wrong. Even Ernst Mayr admitted that.
Oh yeah, but I mean, and it's because evolution happens. You get this movement out of Africa, Homo erectus like fossils.
Yeah, and maybe relatives. Yep.
They evolve into something like a Neanderthal, something like an early Homo, maybe.
Yep.
Some of those die out. Some of them say there's another wave that comes out of Africa, but they're still able to interbreed with
Yeah.
those descendants of the earlier forms, even though it may be 400,000 years later. I mean, it's astonishing. Yes, normally speaking, geographic speciation results, well, usually one of them dies out, but it can result in speciation. But as long as there's some gene flow, it's astonishing. And the human species is a good example of this. It's astonishing how long the interfertility can last. Now, there was probably reduced fertility, you know.
That's true in Neanderthals. We're missing males. There's DNA missing on the male, on the Y chromosome.
Okay, it's like ligers and tiglons. You know, they're tigers are essentially an Asian species. Africans or lions are an African species, but they haven't been separated for long enough to completely speciate. So that's why in zoos you can get tiglons and ligers. But generally speaking, it's the males who are, you know, I mean, generally speaking, the offspring, the tiglon or the liger, the offspring of these crosses, can't reproduce, but those who can are females.
Yeah.
And that's only by back crossing. So, you know, something like that could be a model for what was going on with the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, the early moderns. It's we have so much to understand from the genetics alone.
So the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, and modern humans had a shared ancestor about 600,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That's when they diverged. Denisovans are more closely related to Neanderthals, so they went off on their own way. Then they split. But then there was interbreeding between Denisovans and Neanderthals, Neanderthals and modern humans and Denisovans, mixing between all these groups over time. And so that kept them from being entirely different species. Low-level mixing at the edges, at the boundaries, probably.
Yeah, exactly. And at some point, we're going to have to integrate the Asian Homo erectus with all of this. The Asian Homo erectus, you know, the original Homo erectus.
Right. And is it erectus? Some people split them into different species. I'm a little bit careful with names because some people think there's more species, some think there are fewer. This is partly philosophy about how you lump them together. But
yeah. And frankly, for people like you and I who deal mostly with the general public, it is only confusing things and making things look more complicated than it really is. I mean, I think you and I both think more in this sort of populational sense, the Ernst Mayerian sense about geographic speciation. And it's something like group A evolved into something like group B with a lot of hybridization around the corners. Evolved into something like, but you know, it's not the same thing as the march of time, the classic, you know, hominids marching through time. But it is nonetheless a pattern that we can see in other species, and why not humans? We're not that special.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Scott has asked us, how were these remarkable fossil sites discovered? Any speculations on where there may be as yet undiscovered fossil sites?
That's a really good question. So the fossil sites are discovered. There was sort of a big rush to Africa in the 50s. The Leakeys went into East Africa and started, they lived there. Louis Leakey, Mary Leakey was from England. Louis Leakey was born there. And they started finding fossils of early hominins, very dramatic fossils like the Zinj, child Paranthropus, and Australopithecus. And that started a number of researchers coming in and looking. And what they do is they used to look for, you know, drive in Land Rovers and on foot and look for fossil sites with lots of fossils coming out. They were at about the right age for hominins. There might be a time period. Now researchers can look at satellite imagery and look for eroded areas in the Rift Valley or other parts of the world. And then they can also know the dates of sediments, and they can look in time windows that they're interested in areas. And they go back often to see when they're eroding out. Like maybe this fossil site in East, you know, maybe one of the fossil sites that Johannes Haile Selassie is looking at in Ethiopia is refreshes like every 3 or 4 years. You got to let enough storms and things happen that new fossils start eroding out. You don't go back every single year. Maybe another one erodes faster. That's true in the Rift Valley, which has wonderful volcanics which help you date the fossils. Now, there's a lot of Africa and other parts of the world we haven't looked in. the forests, the jungles. The problem with the jungles are the soils are acidic, so fossils don't persist. Asia, lots of fossils there. Dating is a little harder. So getting the right convergence of knowing how old something is can be difficult. Collapsed caves in South Africa. People have been exploring caves all over the world because they're great repositories for fossils. So sometimes it's amateurs that find these things. Hopefully they leave them in place. Like the monk that found the Denisovan jaw, right? He told them where he found it. They went back in, and luckily they found, DNA and other things. So, yeah.
Indeed. Another question, please. William Hyres says, did the hybrids that emerged from interbreeding eventually take over? And where did the Neanderthal Y chromosome DNA go?
So we have some Neanderthal Y chromosome, but their whole, they call deserts, Neanderthal deserts. They're parts of the genomes that we have today with no Neanderthal DNA that suggests, for example, that those males were sterile when they interbred with modern human females, because we just didn't get DNA on the Y chromosome. We got some, but not all of it. So we have some of it left, I think. I'm not 100% sure about the Y, and that's a good question. Probably we have some of it. The deserts don't usually mean the whole chromosome. They mean big sections of it that we didn't get. The hybrids that emerged, did they take over? Not really, because we're modern human. We're Homo sapiens with a small part of Neanderthal DNA, right? Mm-hmm. And the Neanderthals that had 10% modern human DNA didn't survive. So Homo sapiens took over. We survived. We did take some DNA from other hominins, and we still have it. And it's still doing things in us today. I hope that answers that question.
And that's very cool. Next question, please. My question is, why is the taxonomy of humans being African and non-Africans based on a 2% Neanderthal introgression threshold?
I don't understand that. I'm sorry.
I'm not sure I do either. Let me take another look.
Taxonomy of humans being African and non-Africans. Are we getting at the question of why Africans don't have Neanderthal DNA? So the reason Africans don't is because as modern humans came out of Africa, the ancestors of people out of Africa who aren't of African descent, we're not talking about people of African descent, but when we're talking about Europeans and Asians, as their ancestors came out of Africa, that's when they picked up the Neanderthal DNA. But people in Africa kept evolving, and Neanderthals didn't go into Africa. Now, some Africans have Neanderthal DNA because there were back migrations of Europeans or Asians into Africa who mixed with Africans and passed on some Neanderthal DNA that way. You can pick up a little Neanderthal DNA in some Africans, but that may not be what this question is. 2%, the taxonomy of humans being African and non-African. No, the taxonomy of humans being African and non-African has nothing to do with the Neanderthal DNA. It's just that Africans, there are different patterns of genetics, and Africans in Africa have a lot more diversity in their DNA because they did not go through that founder effect. It's a kind of a bottleneck founder effect. The ancestors of European Asians lost a lot of the genetic diversity that you find today in Africans as they came out of Africa, right? Because
it's founder effect.
It's a founder effect. Like if somebody moves to an island, one guy moves to an island, has a lot of children, there's not a lot of genetic diversity in his offspring on that island. That's a founder effect. So Europeans and Asians don't have as much genetic diversity as Africans who've been evolving all along on the continent of Africa. And they have a little bit of DNA. Exactly. We got some of our diversity by interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, right?
Yep, that increased our diversity.
And in Africa, there were other archaic humans that Africans interbred. We've all interbred with whoever was there, and we just don't know all the people, all the different species. This is the other question. What we're seeing in the fossil record in genetics, what fraction of that is what fraction is it of what was actually there? It's really hard to know. What are we missing? Yeah. Just because we happen to find fossils in places where they eroded out and are dated doesn't mean that there weren't other kinds of hominins across Africa that we've never seen, right? Or that we can't pick up a signal of in our DNA. I think we're not getting all the diversity.
I think you are very likely to be 100% right on that. It's true.
It's not even my idea.
And this has been so much fun, but I know you're on the East Coast and it's really late your time of night. It was very kind of you to stay up so late and enlighten us and entertain us with this wonderful talk. It was really terrific, and I thank you so much again.
Well,
it was
thank
great
you.
seeing you again. And maybe we'll get you back someday and bring us another update, because clearly this is a topic that a lot of the Bay Area skeptics, and we have people listening from all over the world, are very interested in.
It's a
So
great topic.
thank you again, and stay well. Goodbye
Thank you.
now.
You too. Appreciate it.
Okay, the rest of you hang in there, because I need to tell you about next month's speaker. You know, February 12 is Darwin Day. And so we are continuing the evolution theme, if you will, of appropriate for Darwin Day. Our speaker is going to be on February 13th, which is actually the day after Darwin Day, which is February 12th. This will also be at 6:30 p.m. It's another East Coaster, so 6:30 our Pacific time. Our speaker is going to be Mohammed Noor, who is a biology professor at Duke University, and he's authored a book that many of you have probably read or would be very interested in reading if you haven't read it yet, called Live Long and Evolve. And yes, it's all about what you can learn from Star Trek about evolution. His title is Can Star Trek Teach Us About Evolution? And I do hope I'm not spoiling the punchline if I answer, yep. So see you at 6:30 on February 13 next month. And I should also make a quick announcement here, because the Bay Area Skeptics is going to have its very first Skepticamp. And if you have never attended a Skepticamp, this is your chance to do so. This is a free in-person conference. Everybody is invited. And if you want to give a presentation at Skepticamp, that's what Skepticamp is all about. Go to the Bay Area Skeptics website, baskeptics.org, or go to our Facebook page. You'll find more information. We have posted it as an event. It will be posted on the Bay Area Skeptics website as well. And join us. It'll be held in Mountain View on the 9th of February, which is a Sunday, from 9 in the morning till 6 at night. Skepticamp. We're getting together in person, which is something that I think all of us have missed a great deal. So thank you for coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Good night.